What's up, Ego Hackers? Welcome to the Cutting Edge Podcast. I'm your host, C.S. Joseph, and this is Cutting Edge episode for June 2024. We're going to be picking up right where we left off for the personality disorders, and which is great. Although I do have to say that since the last episode, we've had a lot of advancements, and I would like to have the opportunity to actually discuss what some of those advancements are and maybe issue a couple of retractions as a result. And that's what we'll be doing as a result of this podcast. Because I love saying the phrase "as a result" over and over and over with my ENTP rambling nature that I have naturally. So, be that as it may, we were talking about narcissistic personality disorder and also borderline personality disorder. And today we're also going to be discussing histrionic personality disorder and antisocial personality disorder. Okay. So what we know so far is that, just a little bit of review. Unconscious developed extroverted feelers, if they ever go unconscious focused, they basically have borderline personality disorder. And it's based on stages. So you can have stage 1, stage 2, stage 3, and stage 4 of the personality disorder. So stage 1 is basically mild, and then stage 2 is moderate, stage 3 is critical, and stage 4 is like, oh my God, they just committed a heinous crime, essentially. So that's how bad unconscious focus can actually get from these stages. And then also the same thing applies to narcissistic personality disorder. It also has the 4 stages. But narcissistic personality disorder is an unconscious developed introverted feeler, okay? Whereas borderline personality disorder, again, is an extroverted feeler who is unconscious developed, but they're both UF. So these people are UD, UF, right? And the closer and closer they get to subconscious focus, their stages go down until eventually they end up becoming, like, for example, stage 1 subconscious focus. So they're not really dealing so much with the personality disorder as a result, okay? And again, for the purpose of review, borderline personality disorder oftentimes comes as a result of, this is different from what I said previously. I talked about blame previously. We realize it's actually a severe lack of recognition for a child who is an extroverted feeler as a child. A severe lack of recognition that actually causes the personality disorder, which means they're not really thanked for anything. They're not even given the opportunity to be a helper or be helpful, and then as a result of that, they're just kind of neglected by their parents or their family when they've been so helpful. And what this ends up doing is that it could be because like both their parents were extroverted feelers, like mine, and as a result, I had to come to terms with the fact that I had borderline personality disorder when I was UDUF. I thought, borderline personality disorder, but then I realized it was not true. She actually had antisocial personality disorder. She had ASPD. She did not have BPD, okay? So there was not exactly entirely accurate whatsoever. So anyway, the point is that thanklessness ultimately is what causes borderline personality disorder. A person not being thanked, not being given the opportunity to be a helper, because if you have 2 extroverted feeler parents, they're always electing themselves the position of helper all the time, and then they're not really giving their child the opportunity to be the helper, and in fact they will criticize the child who is the extroverted feeling child, and criticize that child and basically take away that child's every opportunity to use their extroverted feeling. And what this does is actually harms their development as a child. They're not even able to develop their ego. So naturally they're going to go unconscious development as a result, because their 2 extroverted feeling parents are emphasizing more on their introverted feeling function. And this is exactly what happened to me. And this is why I developed borderline personality disorder when I was UDUF, okay? And it's a severe problem. And every now and then it will rear its ugly head. If I, octogram transition into unconscious focus temporarily, the borderline personality disorder immediately manifests. And what that does is it creates fear of abandonment, basically. And, a borderliner often has this perspective where they act like, well, I hate you, don't leave me, etc. So they'll lash out at people. while at the same time they don't want to be abandoned, because from their perspective, even if they lash out at somebody, they still want to be accepted, they still want to be valued enough by other people that those people are not going to leave them anyway. So borderliners, what they do, they like to lash out at others to see if they will still stick around, to see if they'll still even like them, because if someone can't like me at my worst, then they really shouldn't be in my life. And this also causes borderline personality disorder people to actually have an abandonment complex, an inferiority complex, where they end up abandoning other people in the process, okay? And so they're afraid of abandoning, but they're also a lot more likely to abandon other people, essentially, or at least test people in such a way where it leads to them abandoning. And a lot of people don't realize, but borderline personality disorder is also like, people are like extremely, extremely selfish. And it's because their introverted feeling function within their unconscious side of their mind is actually far more overdeveloped than probably it should be. Because what should be happening is that their extroverted feeling function in their ego should be more developed than their introverted feeling function in their unconscious. And then when that happens, there's an imbalance there. And then again, that leads to the borderline personality disorder, right? So oftentimes they end up getting to the perspective where they realize that people in general are just not... Anyway, as I was saying, when it comes to borderliners, it's funny because oftentimes borderliners are actually accused of having narcissistic personality disorder. And the reason why is because they've had to rely on an overblown introverted feeling function in their shadow, such that they actually look like that they're the true narcissist. They look like that they're entirely selfish. And the reason why is because when they're in survival mode as UDUF, they're trying to get to a point where they are, gosh, what do you call... So entirely self-reliant, I guess is the point I'm trying to make. They're really self-reliant, kind of almost like too self-reliant. And the point, when it gets to a point where they're being like really selfish, like overly selfish. And then they become very unhelpful to the point where, since they have had to be forced to overly invest in their introverted feeling function, they actually end up having their extroverted feeling function less developed than their introverted feeling function in their shadow. And then because of that, they lack empathy. And because they lack empathy, they come off as someone who's entirely selfish, and they come off as someone who's entirely entitled, right? This is why borderliners oftentimes are misdiagnosed with NPD, when the reality situation is that's not accurate at all, okay? That is not accurate, no way. Narcissistic personality disorder is a little bit different, like we talked about previously. It is basically it's about a child who is an FI user, but they were forced to be an FE user, basically. Forced to take emotional responsibility for other people in their lives, especially their parents. Narcissists are people who, as children, have had to be emotional support structures to their parents, especially if their parents are all FI users, basically. If they have two FI user parents, this is really bad for children. Very, very bad for children, because then their own emotional health is not able to develop as a result. And this can be a huge problem, a very big problem. Because it's like, hey, I have to be helping everyone else, and they end up ignoring themselves, and then the child ends up having this core belief as they get older that they're literally responsible for everything in their life. And then as a result of that, they end up developing a superiority complex, versus the borderliner who ends up developing an inferiority complex. And this too ends up becoming, a big problem. But yeah, as near as I can tell, the primary cause of narcissistic personality disorder is having two introverted feeling parents basically at the same time. And the primary cause of borderline personality disorder is having two extroverted feeling parents. And then you have the same emotional functions cognitively as your parents, basically, and that's what causes these things. And same thing goes with ASPD, which is subconscious developed types who are TI users, as well as histrionic personality disorder, or HPD, and they have extroverted thinking with two extroverted thinking parents. Now, again, the way to solve this problem is obviously have a polygynous relationship where you have multiple adults, multiple women, one man, multiple emotional sources, so that every child, regardless of their personality type, is able to get their mental needs met, basically. That's how you can easily solve this problem with no issue whatsoever. Even though it's a very controversial hot take, it is a way to guarantee the emotional health of your children and keep them out of unconscious focus, much less even potentially unconscious development. Children develop so much better and they're in safer environments, in a polygynous home structure as a result, right? Because all of their cognitive needs are met as a result of that. And that way there is a lower chance of all of the primary adults in their life having all of the same cognitive functions as them, basically. Because children really need to actually have compatibility with at least one of their parents. It's really, really critical that children have that. It's really important. So just something to be aware of within this phenomenon. It's absolutely critical. So now antisocial personality disorder is a little bit different. What it does is that what antisocial personality disorder does is they end up developing a God complex. We have borderliners who have an inferiority complex. You have narcissists who have a superiority complex. But antisocial personality disorder has a God complex. And the thing is that they were basically in a situation where, as a child, they were never actually allowed to be the problem solver. They never got to be in that role. Let's say they had two TI user parents, and those TI user parents basically were taking on the role of problem solver and never actually allowed their child to problem solve anything, right? And one of the things about problem solving people, TI user children, especially if they're SD, as children, and they end up being unconscious focused as a result. SD children have this thing, they're kind of more, as a TI user, they're more invested in their TI. And when this happens, and they're not able to be that problem solver, they end up, and they may solve problems, but they end up feeling like they're not solving any problems. Why? Because no one's listening to them. Because their TI user parents expect the child to listen to them, but the child is not being listened to. And that's literally the cause of antisocial personality disorder. They'll turn into antisocial people. They'll want to not be around it. And then it ends up creating an identity crisis to a point. Histrionics and antisocial personality disorder people, they really, really struggle with knowing their identity. Whereas borderliners and narcissists are actually over-invested in their own identity. The antisocial and histrionic personality disorders those people are under-invested in their identity. And this also ends up becoming a thing. Also, folks, even though I should probably do an entire episode devoted to this, if you're an antisocial personality disorder, that's your ego personality disorder. You have a shadow personality disorder, and that's borderline, okay? If your ego personality disorder is narcissistic personality disorder, your shadow personality disorder is oh my God, a histrionic personality disorder, okay? So really, you actually have two personality disorders simultaneously when you're unconscious focused, and you got to be aware of that, okay? You got to watch out for that too. So you actually have two things that you have to worry about when you're unconscious focused as a person, because unconscious focus is actually a very unhealthy thing for a human being, very unhealthy mental state for a human being to actually be in. So you got to watch out for that, okay? So again, all these personality disorders have the various stages. These are the various causes. I think the most likely cause, like I said, are parents who have the same cognitive functions, decision-making functions, emotional functions as their children, and those children are being emotionally set up for failure to develop these emotional personality disorders, to have emotional problems as a result. So histrionic personality disorder is a little bit different. They have this shallow complex. I don't really know what complex to really talk about in terms of how to properly label it, but they're very shallow people. They're very attention-seeking, or can be attention-seeking. And if they're SE users, if they're SI users, they're more about desirability-seeking and trying to be as desirable as possible. And they end up having real shallow relationships. They want to be around the popular kids and draw upon popularity, because from their perspective, popularity is what they utilize to get their emotional needs met. This usually happens when they have two extroverted thinking parents, and those parents lord over their own emotional needs to have status over their child. And so those parents care more about their own status and their own achievements than that of their child, their extroverted thinking child that they have. And their youngster basically ends up never feeling like they're good enough. They never actually feel like they're worth it, and they become so overly invested in later in life trying to be an achiever, and to the point where they'll actually step on other people and use other people like a ladder to achieve what they want to achieve and gain more status in the context of their life. And this ends up causing even more problems, okay? So because of that, they never really have deep, meaningful relationships. They also, for some reason, read into relationships in such a way where like they assume people have a crush on them when they actually don't. Their sense of status is so overblown that they actually feel like they're really important, or would like really be important. And oftentimes these people end up being doormatted, and which is rough, you know. And one of the ways that they get doormatted is that they don't enforce boundaries. Extroverted thinking children with histrionic, or people who have with histrionic personality disorder, their main problem is that they never tell other people what their boundaries are, and they violate other people's boundaries consistently. Communication of boundaries is ultimately extroverted thinking, okay? And they're not even allowed to have boundaries. And that ends up becoming a problem over and over and over, a lack of boundaries. They don't communicate the boundaries, and then they'll start enforcing boundaries that they never communicated, right? And they'll cut people out of their life as a result of that lack of boundaries that they're setting. And this ends up becoming a huge problem, right? So managing of boundaries versus, you know, so they're like having this boundaryless complex, or this unspoken boundaries complex that they have, versus the ASPD, antisocial personality disorder people end up having like this insane God complex as a result, because they never got the opportunity to become the problem solver as a child, so they overemphasize in their adulthood being the problem solver, just like the histrionic people never got the opportunity as a child to be popular, so they work everything to be popular, to utilize their adulthood to get their emotional needs met. Okay, this is literally what unconscious focus actually fundamentally is, and that's where all of these personality disorders end up becoming a huge problem over time. So we're going to be getting into introverted tools and extroverted tools. All right, here we go. So let's discuss borderline personality disorder. Like, what is the extroverted tool that people need to do in a person with BPD's life? What they need to do is they need to thank them. Like, seriously, FE users who are UDUF, they are starved for gratitude. They want gratitude, okay? They're really starved for gratitude, you know. And then histrionic people are very starved for respect. They're constantly disrespected, and they have this insanely overblown need for respect. These are histrionic people, and this is so overblown that their relationships end up being extremely shallow as a result, which is a big problem. You got to watch out for that, okay? So then beyond that, you have the narcissistic personality disorder. They're very starved for, you know, even like feeling important on their own and having their own, being allowed to be who they are, basically, and actually put themselves first, right? And then ASPD people, they're starved for being listened to, right? So what people are starving for, this is where we can infer what the extroverted tool is to actually solve these personality disorders, okay? So the extroverted tool is, for the borderline personality disorder, is give them gratitude. Actually thank them. Help get them away from the despair of thanklessness. Okay, that's what you do. For the person with narcissism, the cure with narcissism is encourage them to be narcissistic. No, encourage them to put themselves first, basically. That is also the introverted tool. They have to put themselves first. But the thing is that what you do, they're starved for empathy, basically. NPD people are starved for empathy, so you need to shower them in empathy. That is the extroverted tool. So that they're not the ones who's expected to be the person who is empathetic. They're the ones who need empathy the most, okay? Versus borderliners, who are the people who need gratitude the most. They need to be thanked. Versus the narcissist, they need to be helped. So you help them. Help is empathy. So be as empathetic as possible. Help. That is empathy. That is the most important thing. That is how you help a narcissistic personality disorder person actually heal. The introverted tool is that for borderliners is that they need to learn how to be grateful themselves and also be thankful for what they have, okay? It's really hard for them to be thankful for what they have and actually not be entitled, because borderliners are actually the ones that struggle with entitlement the most, more so than narcissists actually, which is kind of counterintuitive, but it is actually truth. So why borderliners are oftentimes misdiagnosed as narcissists even though they're actually borderline. That's something to keep track of, okay? Then beyond that, you have the narcissist. They just need to be helped. The more you help the narcissist, because the narcissist sees it as like, hey, the person who is the helper is the person who has the most power, right? But if it destroys their superiority complex, they can't feel superior if they're the person who is being helped, because an FI user naturally wants to be helped and propped up and supported by other people. You see what I'm saying? Whereas the extroverted feeler wants to naturally be helped as much as possible, from that perspective. Help is ultimately everything, right? So keep that in mind. This is the introverted and extroverted tool for borderline versus narcissism. I just want to do some review here. Now, for the antisocial personality disorder, these things are a little bit interesting, but that God complex is hard. The introverted tool for the ASPD people is that they need to realize that they don't know everything, and they need to spend more time researching them. They also need to be listened to. That is the extroverted tool. And the extroverted tool, the best way to practice active listening in an effort to convince an ASPD person is to practice the Socratic method. Utilize the Socratic method, that is the extroverted tool, because it's the best form of active listening while simultaneously potentially even being able to convince the ASPD person that they might actually be incorrect about something. Because their entire identity is based on their ability to solve problems and actually be all-knowing. They see themselves as someone who's all-knowing, but the Socratic method basically really ends up telling the ego that, hey, by the way, you don't actually know. You don't actually know what you're talking about. And that's very important. Some of the most important things that you can actually see or understand. So keep that in mind, right? So the extroverted tool, at the end of the day, is listening, active listening, and then to get the absolute best result, utilize the Socratic method. And as for them, they need to realize that they're acting like know-it-alls, they don't actually know everything. Maybe they should actually spend time doing research to confirm whether or not what they know is actually the truth, instead of like having an internalized echo chamber, which is what ASPD people often have. And this is one of the reasons why they don't really socialize people, or they have a tendency to alienate everyone in their lives because they're just walking around know-it-alls, essentially. And that's like a big problem, right? An SDUF ISTP woman, for example, with her obstinance and being that know-it-all, she literally has antisocial personality disorder. This is a problem, okay? This is a big problem, right? Then, beyond that, we have histrionic personality disorder. And the extroverted tool is basically always show respect to the person who has histrionic personality disorder, but do so in a way where you remind them that they have boundaries and that they should be enforcing their boundaries, and that you could help them enforce their boundaries, basically. This will help them draw upon an identity. This is the extroverted tool for them. The introverted tool for them is that they need to recognize that it is okay to have boundaries, but it is their responsibility to communicate those boundaries ahead of time before they enforce them, and that they're not allowed to enforce any boundaries or even feel bad unless they actually have first communicated them. And that's the introverted tool for histrionic personality disorder. And this will allow them to have deep, meaningful relationships, because histrionic people, they don't want to be polarizing. They really don't want to be polarizing. And they really don't want to be around polarizing people, because histrionic people never want to rock the boat. They never want to rock the boat. Okay, so because from their perspective, if you're not polarizing, you can be accepted by everyone. The problem is if you're not polarizing, and being polarizing is part of the introverted tool for histrionic personality disorder, the more polarizing you are, well, yeah, you're going to have a lot of people who hate you, but you're also going to have people who love you. Versus if you're not polarizing at all, no one is going to love you. Like literally nobody. It's just going to be entirely neutral, and it's going to suck. So, let's see. And HPD has a statement, I cannot know myself, you tell me who I am. That's why they struggle with boundaries. For ASPD is, I know you, but you cannot know me, basically. Their other people's identity bends because of me, versus the HPD thing is my identity bends because of others, essentially. And it's all about management of identity. And yeah, we covered all of the introverted and extroverted tools for those, and communication boundaries, everything. So very well. I covered all of the content for the 4 personality disorders. So anyway, folks, thanks for watching and listening, and I'll see you guys on the next Cutting Edge for July 2024. See you then.